The gloves were the first thing anyone noticed about Thea Morrow. Not her face, though it was fine-boned and serious in the way of women who had learned early that prettiness invited trouble. Not the careful plainness of her dress, which was clean and pressed, but clearly not new. It was always the gloves, ivory cotton, buttoned to the wrist, worn even on warm afternoons when every other woman in the room had long since peeled hers off. She wore them to market, she wore them to church, she wore them the morning she arrived at Ashwick Hall as the new Countess of Dunmore, stepping down from the carriage with her chin lifted and her hands clasped quietly in front of her, and if the household staff gathered on the front steps noticed anything strange about a bride arriving in August, wearing gloves, none of them said so to her face. They said it to each other, of course. Thea knew. She always knew. She had grown up the daughter of a magistrate in a small town in Devonshire, where everyone knew everyone else's business and discussed it openly over hedgerows and at the butcher's counter. Privacy was not something she had ever been afforded. She had learned instead to carry herself in a way that discouraged certain questions, back straight, voice even, eyes that met yours and did not flinch. She had learned to give people just enough to satisfy their curiosity without giving them anything that actually mattered. The gloves were a test, in a way. The ones who stared and said nothing were manageable. The ones who asked outright could be deflected with a soft laugh and a remark about the cold. It was the ones who watched and said nothing and kept watching. Those were the ones to be careful of. She had not anticipated Philippa Dunmore. The Earl of Dunmore, Reginald Ashwick, had not been looking for a wife when he found one. His solicitor had put the match forward, something about a land dispute between the Dunmore estate and the Morrow family that might be resolved tidily through a marriage rather than through the courts. Thea's father, faced with the prospect of a lengthy legal battle he could not afford, had agreed. Thea herself had been consulted, which was more than some women received, and she had said yes after thinking about it for 3 days. She was 26. She had already buried one man, her first husband, a kind and unremarkable solicitor named Henry, who had died of a fever 2 years earlier, and left her with a small house, a smaller income, and the particular invisibility that settled over young widows like dust. She was not naive about what marriage meant. She was also not naive about what the alternative meant, returning to her father's house, becoming useful, becoming smaller by degrees, until there was nothing left of her but usefulness. Reginald Ashwick was 41, broad-shouldered, quiet in the deliberate way of men who had decided at some point that most things were not worth the energy of speech. He had one daughter from his first marriage, a girl of 8 named Bess, who regarded Thea with open suspicion, and was therefore, Thea decided immediately, her favourite person in the house. He had no brothers, he had one sister. Philippa Dunmore was 35 and unmarried, and she had been running Ashwick Hall for 11 years with the competence and territorial certainty of a general who has held a position so long she has forgotten it was ever anyone else's. Thea understood this within the first hour. She was given a tour of the house by the housekeeper, a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Haig, and at every room they entered, Philippa was already there, or had recently been there, or had left instructions there that Mrs. Haig reported to Thea in the careful tone of a woman navigating between two authorities she did not wish to antagonize. The Rose Parlour, Miss Dunmore prefers the curtains drawn in the afternoons. The library, Miss Dunmore has arranged the cataloguing herself. The morning room, Miss Dunmore takes breakfast here. And where does the Countess take breakfast? Thea asked pleasantly. Mrs. Haig blinked. Wherever you prefer, my lady. Thea smiled. The morning room, I think. It has a lovely aspect. Reginald told her about the gloves on their 3rd evening together. He was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had not asked many questions in his life and had not started now. He noticed, in the way he noticed most things about Thea, with a sort of careful peripheral attention, as though looking at her directly might constitute some imposition, that she kept them on through dinner, through the evening, through everything but sleep. You needn't explain if you'd rather not, he said. They were in the library. He was reading something about crop rotation, and she was pretending to read something else. But I find I'm curious, she considered him. He had an honest face. She had been burned by honest faces before, but she had also learned to distinguish between the honesty that was a quality of character and the honesty that was merely an absence of sophistication. Reginald's was the former kind. "Burns," she said simply. "From when I was a child. They're healed. They've been healed a long time, but the skin is not pretty, and I find it is easier for everyone if I simply keep them covered." He nodded slowly. He did not say "I'm sorry" in the automatic way that made the apology meaningless. He said, "What happened?" She had not expected that either. "A kitchen accident," she said. "I was 7. I tried to pull a pot from the fire by myself because the cook had gone out and I was hungry and impatient." She paused. "My father always said it was an example of what happened when women overreached themselves." The silence in the library had a particular quality after that. Reginald set down his book. "Your father," he said carefully, "sounds like a man with a great many convenient examples." Thea looked at him for a long moment. "He is," she said. It was, she would think later, the beginning of something real between them. Philippa Dunmore had a gift for cold civility that Thea could only admire in the abstract, the way one could admire the workings of a mechanism designed expressly to injure you. She was never openly rude. She was never anything that could be pointed to directly and named. She simply did small things, carefully calibrated things, the way water works on stone, arriving first to every room, so that Thea always felt she was entering someone else's space, addressing her as my brother's wife, rather than Reginald's wife or Thea or my lady. Questioning household decisions with the lightest possible touch of surprise, as though she had simply assumed that anyone in Thea's position would naturally have done things differently, and was not so much objecting as expressing benign puzzlement. "I only wonder," Philippa said one afternoon, in the particular musical way she had of beginning sentences that ended badly, "whether Cook has advised you about Reginald's stomach. He cannot eat onion in any quantity." "But of course you could not have known that." "Reginald told me last week," Thea said. "I've already spoken to Cook." Philippa smiled the smile of a woman absorbing a minor defeat with perfect grace. "How efficient you are." Thea became very good at keeping her voice pleasant. She had practice. She had been keeping her voice pleasant for 26 years, and she was by now rather expert at it. What she had not anticipated was the gloves becoming a weapon. The dinner was Philippa's idea, or rather, it emerged from Philippa's idea, a gathering of neighbours and friends, 12 in total, the sort of event that Ashwick Hall hosted every autumn as a matter of tradition. Thea had no objection to it. She had grown up in a magistrate's household. She knew how to sit at a table with strangers and ask them questions about themselves and seem genuinely interested, which she generally was. People were interesting. Even unpleasant people were interesting. They told you things about themselves without meaning to. She dressed carefully. She had not had time to commission new clothes since coming to Ashwick Hall. The marriage had moved quickly, and her father's household had not run to the kind of dressmaker's credit that allowed for the assembly of a full trousseau. She had good pieces, carefully maintained, but her evening gown was from 2 seasons past, and its back was lower than she would have preferred. She stood before the mirror in her dressing room and looked at the gloves and thought about what to do. Her lady's maid, a young woman named Dotty, who had been assigned to her by Mrs. Haig and who was, Thea had decided, almost certainly reporting to Philippa, was watching her with an expression of careful neutrality. "I'll wear the pearl drop earrings," Thea said, "and the ivory gloves." "The long ones, my lady?" "Yes." They went to the elbow, the long gloves. They covered everything. She put them on and looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who was prepared. She had not anticipated that Philippa was more prepared. The dinner was going well, in the particular way that dinners went well when they were being managed by someone who had been managing them for 11 years. The food was excellent. The wine was good. The guests, neighbours, a local baronet and his wife, a retired naval captain who laughed too loudly and was therefore beloved by everyone, a pair of maiden sisters who collected theological pamphlets, 2 couples from a neighbouring county whom Thea had not previously met, were all in high spirits, and Thea had successfully navigated the first 2 courses without incident. She was seated at Reginald's right, as was proper. Philippa was 3 seats down on the same side of the table, which meant that Thea could not see her easily, which was, she was aware, exactly where Philippa had placed herself in the seating arrangement. The conversation around her was lively. The naval captain, who was called Captain Bryce, was telling a story about a storm off the coast of Portugal that involved 3 broken masts and what he described as a perfectly sensible decision to pray. Reginald was listening with what Thea had come to recognise as genuine amusement, which on his face looked very like no expression at all, but involved a slight relaxation around his eyes. She was watching the careful, private warmth of it, thinking, not for the first time, that she had made a better bargain than she had expected. She did not hear Philippa rise from her chair. She heard the sound, a rustle, a soft collective intake of breath from the guests, near the end of the table. And then she felt the air on her arms, a cool, sudden rush, and she understood before she had time to think it through that the gloves were gone. Philippa had come up behind her. She had drawn the gloves off in a single smooth motion, the kind of motion that only looks spontaneous when it has been rehearsed. "I do beg your pardon," Philippa said, in the bright, social voice of a woman who does not beg anyone's pardon for anything. "I noticed your gloves seemed to be troubling you. You were adjusting them earlier, weren't you? I thought perhaps they had slipped." The table went quiet. Thea's arms were on the tablecloth, both of them. The left was fine, pale, the skin fine-grained, nothing remarkable. The right was different. The right was the way it had always been. The skin that had healed when she was 7 years old and healed imperfectly. The surface that looked, even now, like candle wax that had cooled too quickly, thickened and furrowed from the wrist to halfway up the forearm, silver white in the candlelight. Every person at that table could see it clearly. They were seated across from her, facing her. The great dining table at Ashwick Hall was wide enough that Philippa's plan had a fatal miscalculation, one that Thea would understand only later. The guests on Thea's side of the table could not see the surface of her arms at all, but the guests on the opposite side, all 6 of them, had a perfect, unobstructed view. No one spoke. The naval captain, who had survived 3 broken masts and had excellent instincts about when a situation had gone from bad to irretrievable, put down his fork. Thea did not move. She had learned in 26 years not to move when the thing she had feared finally happened. Movement invited more movement. Stillness was its own kind of power. She sat with her arms on the tablecloth and let the silence go on for exactly as long as it needed to. And then she lifted her chin and looked at the woman directly across from her. The baronet's wife, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Fowler, whom Thea had spoken with earlier about her kitchen garden, and said in a voice that did not waver, "Burns. From childhood. I was 7 and impatient, and I pulled a pot from the fire by myself." She paused. "I've been told it was an example of what happens when women overreach themselves," she said. "I find I'm less convinced of that than I used to be." Mrs. Fowler looked at her steadily for a moment. Then she said, "My youngest brother fell from a tree when he was 9 trying to reach the highest apples. He broke his arm in 2 places. We always said it was an example of what happens when you want something badly enough to climb for it." A pause. "He became an orchardist." The naval captain laughed. It was not a polite laugh, it was the laugh of a man who meant it. The conversation resumed. Not all at once. It came back in pieces, the way light came back after a cloud had passed. But it resumed and it built again, and by the time the 3rd course arrived, the table was full of noise and warmth, and Thea's arms were in plain view on the tablecloth, and no one found it remarkable. Philippa had returned to her seat. She sat with her back very straight, and her face composed into the expression she wore when she had decided, for strategic reasons, not to look at something. Reginald had not spoken during any of this. Thea looked at him now. His hands were flat on the tablecloth, very still, and his jaw was set in a way she had not seen before. He was looking at his sister with an expression that Thea read, after a moment, as grief, not surprise, not anger precisely, but the particular grief of a man who hoped for a long time that something would not be true and has now been shown, definitively, that it is. He reached over beneath the tablecloth and put his hand over hers, the scarred one. He did not say anything. He simply left it there, warm and deliberate, for the rest of the evening. Philippa came to Thea's sitting room the following morning. Thea was already up, already dressed, already at her writing desk. Because she had not slept particularly well and had decided at 5 in the morning that she would rather be productive than lie awake being unproductive. She was writing letters. The one to her father was going slowly. When Philippa entered, Thea put down her pen and turned to face her and waited. She had expected anger, or another performance of composed offence, the kind where the wrong done is somehow reframed as a misunderstanding by the person who did it. She had not expected what Philippa actually did, which was to stand in the doorway for a moment looking at her with an expression Thea had never seen on her face before. Something raw and tired, the face beneath the mask rather than the mask. And then to say, without preamble, "I wanted you to leave." "I know," Thea said. "I have managed this household since I was 24 years old." Philippa came further into the room. She did not sit. She stood near the window, her hands clasped, her back to the morning light. Our mother was gone. Reginald was grieving. Bess was 3. There was no one else. "I understand that," Thea said. "I don't want your understanding." There was something fierce and honest in Philippa's voice now, the way a wound is honest. Not because it chooses to be, but because concealment has become impossible. "I wanted you to go. I thought if everyone saw you as someone with something to hide, someone unsuitable, someone who had deceived Reginald." "I did not deceive your brother," Thea said. "He knew," he asked, "and I told him the first week we were here." Philippa stopped. "He knew," Thea said again, quietly. "He has always known." The silence that followed was different from the silence at the dinner table. That had been a silence of shock, of breath held. This one was the silence of something collapsing, slowly, without drama, simply failing under its own weight. "He never said," Philippa said. "No." Thea turned her right hand over in her lap, looking at it the way she had not allowed herself to look at it in company for years. "He didn't." The sitting room was very quiet. Somewhere below, Thea could hear Bess arguing with her governess about something, and the governess's patient response, and Bess arguing again with the particular tenacity of a child who has inherited her father's stubbornness without his restraint. "What will happen now?" Philippa asked. She sounded, for the first time since Thea had arrived at Ashwick Hall, like a woman who was asking a genuine question rather than positioning a piece on a board. "That depends on your brother," Thea said. "But I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think he is a man who is capable of being just. I've seen it. I believe in it." She paused. "I also think this house is large enough for both of us if we choose to make it so. I am not here to displace you, Philippa. I am here because I had very few choices, and this one seemed worth taking." She looked up. I had not expected to find it was more than that. Philippa stood for a long moment. Then she moved to the chair across from the writing desk and sat down, which was, Thea thought, a kind of answer. Reginald spoke to his sister that afternoon. Thea did not ask what was said. She could read something of it in the way he came to find her afterward. In the garden, where she had taken Bess to look for interesting beetles, because Bess had decided that interesting beetles were a legitimate scientific pursuit, and Thea had decided that Bess was right, and stood for a moment watching the two of them crouched over a patch of moss, with a concentration of people engaged in genuinely important work. "She'll be staying," he said when Thea straightened and looked at him. "For now, if that suits you." "It suits me," Thea said. He nodded. Then he looked at her hand, the right one bare now, because she had taken both gloves off to help Bess turn over a flat stone. And he said, in the careful way he had of saying things that mattered, "You needn't wear them. Not here. Not if you'd rather not." She looked down at her hands. The morning light was direct and unsparing, and the scarred skin was fully visible, and she waited for the familiar reflex of concealment, the reaching for cover, and found that it was slower to arrive than it used to be. "Not yet," she said, "but perhaps. In time." He accepted this the way he accepted most things, quietly, without pushing. Bess had discovered something in the moss, and was announcing it with great urgency, and Reginald crouched down beside her, with the grave interest of a man taking a child's important work seriously, and Thea stood in the garden at Ashwick Hall and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been right to climb. The autumn moved into winter, and winter arranged itself around the bones of the house like it always had, and Thea learned the rhythms of the place. Which chimneys drew well, and which required coaxing, which tenants needed checking on first after a hard frost. Which mornings Reginald left early to ride the far fields, and which ones he sat at the breakfast table, long past when he needed to. She learned the names and particular stubborn dignities of every member of the household staff. She learned that Bess's governess had been there for 3 years and was quietly desperate for intellectual conversation. And she began leaving books on her desk, and this became its own kind of friendship. She and Philippa did not become easy with each other quickly. That would have been too simple, too convenient, the kind of resolution that happened in stories rather than in houses, where two capable women had been placed in competition by circumstances neither of them had chosen. What they became instead was wary and gradually less wary, the way wild things grew accustomed to each other when the territory was large enough to share, and the winter long enough to outlast old grievances. Philippa had a gift for organisation that Thea had previously experienced only as a weapon directed at her. It was, she discovered, genuinely impressive when it was not. She began consulting her on household matters, not as a deference, but as a practical acknowledgement that Philippa knew things about Ashwick Hall that Thea did not, and that this knowledge was worth respecting. Philippa, in turn, began offering it without the performance of reluctant superiority that had characterized the first months. It was not warmth exactly, but it was something workable and honest, and Thea had long since learned that workable and honest was often more durable than warmth. By the time the first snowfall came, she had stopped wearing the gloves inside the house. Not outside, not yet. That was still the reflex of 17 years, and she was not in the business of pretending that things changed faster than they did. But inside, in the rooms she had come to know, among the people who had come to be hers in the specific and unglamorous way, that people became yours when you paid attention to them and showed up and did the work, without requiring that it be noticed. Inside, she let her hands be what they were. Reginald noticed the first morning she came to the breakfast table without them. He did not comment. He poured her tea, which was a thing he had begun doing at some point, and had never stopped, and he handed the cup to her right hand, the scarred one, the way a man hands a cup to his wife, without thinking, without calculation, simply because she was there and it was morning, and the fire was lit, and outside the first snow of the year was beginning to fall against the windows of Ashwick Hall. She took it. She thought, I have been 7 years old and alone, and I have pulled things from fires and been burned and been blamed for the burning, and I have carried it, and it has made me careful and wary and sometimes afraid, and I have arrived, somehow, at a table where someone hands me a cup of tea on a winter morning as though I have always been expected here. She drank her tea. Bess came thundering down the stairs too loudly and demanded to know if the snow was deep enough to make proper use of. Reginald said it was not, in his opinion, and she argued this strenuously, and Thea sided with Bess, which she did whenever it was reasonable, because the look on Reginald's face when he was outvoted by his own household was something she had found she liked very much. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the house was warm, and Thea Morrow, Thea Ashwick now, though she was still getting used to it, sat at the breakfast table at Ashwick Hall with her hands in plain view and nowhere she needed to hide them, and thought that this, improbably and honestly, and without any of the grace she might have wished for, was what she had climbed for.